There is an island in the middle of the Indian Ocean with almost no civilians left on it. British soil, American bombers, a runway long enough for the heaviest aircraft in the inventory, a lagoon deep enough for carriers and prepositioned ships, and a silence where villages used to be. Its name is Diego Garcia, and once you see what was done to put a base there, you will never look at a blank blue map the same way again. Zoom out until the continents are only edges. Africa to the west, India and Southeast Asia to the east, Australia far to the southeast. In the middle of that emptiness sits a horseshoe of coral, the largest island in the Chagos Archipelago, not near anything tourists casually visit, not on the way to anywhere. Unless you are projecting military power across half the planet. That is the first paradox. The middle of nowhere is the middle of everywhere that matters. From this atoll, planners measure flight times toward the Persian Gulf, toward the Strait of Hormuz, the oil choke of the world, toward the Strait of Malacca, the shipping artery of Asia, toward East Africa and the approaches to the Red Sea. One coral ring, multiple theaters, one flagpole that says Britain, and a flight line that says United States. But Diego Garcia did not start as a fortress. It started as a living place. Long before the bombers, the Chagos were plantation islands. Coconut oil and copra, company managers, island workers. People lived on Diego Garcia and on the outer islands, Peros Banhos, Salomon, and the smaller settlements that do not show up on most classroom globes. They were Creole islanders with roots in the archipelago, later called Chagossians, or Ilois, tied into the economy of Mauritius the way island people are always tied to a larger port. They had churches, they had cemeteries, they had names for reefs and for the arms of the lagoon. Children were born there, families rotated between the islands and Port Louis when the sea was the road. This was not a deserted speck waiting for history to invent a use for it. It was home. British administrators counted those people when it was convenient, and when it became inconvenient, they tried to redefine them out of existence. The Cold War rewrote the paperwork first. In the mid-1960s, London and Washington wanted a secure foothold in the Indian Ocean, a place for communications, staging, and later a full air and naval hub far from hostile coasts. Mauritius was moving toward independence. The Chagos Archipelago was still administered as part of that colony. So in 1965, Britain detached the Chagos and created a new colony, the British Indian Ocean Territory, the BIOT. One of the last colonies Britain carved on the map of Africa's ocean approaches. Mauritius would become independent in 1968. The Chagos would not go with it. That detachment was not a cartographic accident. It was a precondition for a deal. In 1966, the United Kingdom and the United States signed an agreement making the islands available for defense purposes, with language that pointed toward islands without a resident civilian population. In plain English, if you want the base, the people cannot stay in the way. The logic of empire and the logic of a clean military footprint fused into one sentence. Files from the era show officials worrying about the United Nations, about what it would look like to keep a colony, and about what it would look like to admit a permanent population lived there. So the language bent: transient workers, contract labor, anything except a people with a homeland. Then the removals began. Between the late 1960s and 1973, the entire Chagossian population was cleared from the archipelago. Some left for medical trips or family visits to Mauritius and found they were blocked from returning. Others were told the plantations were closing and that ships would take them away. Pets were killed so no one would try to stay for the animals. Homes were left behind. An island society was treated like debris to be swept before the bulldozers arrived. Historians later estimated well over 1,000 Ilois displaced to Mauritius and more to the Seychelles, numbers that paperwork had tried to shrink. Britain and the United States had their empty island. The Chagossians had Exile. Diego Garcia became a construction site for strategic geography. The west arm of the atoll took a runway that could handle bombers and tankers, a concrete spear laid along coral. The lagoon became an anchorage, a sheltered sheet of water where maritime prepositioning ships could wait with tanks, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts for wars that had not yet been named. Fuel farms rose, communications arrays listened, barracks filled with personnel who would rotate through a place the public was not invited to visit. No resort hotels, no civilian ferry schedule. A British Indian Ocean territory in the legal header, and an American expeditionary machine in the daily reality. Walk the paradox on the ground, even if only through photographs. Palm trees and a flight line, turquoise water and restricted airspace, a chapel and a bomb dump. Beauty arranged around denial of access. And the machine worked. When the United States needed to project force into the Persian Gulf and beyond, Diego Garcia was already sitting on the chessboard. In the build-up to Desert Storm, the island's pre-positioned stocks and airfield mattered in ways television maps almost never showed. After September 11th, bombers and tankers used that runway as a bridge toward Afghanistan. In the Iraq War years, the same logic held: if you need reach across the Indian Ocean rim without begging for a crowded Allied coast, you need a place like this. Later operations against threats in Yemen and across the wider region kept proving the geography. Diego Garcia is not famous because it is scenic. It is famous, among planners, because it is useful. An empty island that was never empty of purpose. There is a third layer people skip when they only talk about bombers. The base is also a logistics nervous system. Ships in the lagoon are floating warehouses. Tankers turn the runway into a gas station for global air power. Surveillance and communications make the atoll a sensor as much as a spear tip. In a crisis where a nearer port is threatened or denied, this coral horseshoe becomes the fallback that keeps a campaign fed. That is why arguments about sovereignty get so loud. Change the legal wrapper, and people fear you change the reliability of the machine. Meanwhile, the people who had been removed did not vanish. They lived in Mauritius and the Seychelles, and later in Britain, in poverty for many, in exile for all. They organized, they sued, they protested outside courts with photographs of islands they were told to forget. They told the story the files had tried to bury, that an indigenous island people had been erased to make room for a runway. British courts sometimes agreed the expulsion was unlawful. Then the politics of the base slammed the door shut again. Orders in council, appeals, settlements that offered money without a return ticket to Diego Garcia itself. In 2019, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion. Britain's continued administration of the Chagos was unlawful. The archipelago should be returned to Mauritius as rapidly as possible. The United Nations General Assembly backed that direction with a thumping vote. London resisted for years, citing security. Washington watched the lease on the most useful rock in the ocean. That is the second paradox, a base sold as indispensable to global security, built on a foundation that international law kept calling illegitimate. Then the map began to move again. In October 2024, Britain announced it would recognize Mauritian sovereignty over the Chagos. In May 2025, London and Port Louis signed a treaty. Mauritius sovereign over the archipelago, the United Kingdom retaining authority to run the Diego Garcia base under a long lease, initially 99 years, with options to extend further. Billions of pounds across the life of the payments. A political firestorm in Britain about cost, about China, about whether the base was truly secured or merely rented under a new flag. Arguments in Washington about whether any sovereignty shift, even with a lease, was an acceptable risk. And for many Chagossians, a bitter footnote. The map's title changing while the right of return to Diego Garcia itself remained tangled inside the military footprint that caused their exile in the first place. Outer islands might someday mean something different. The Runway Island remains the hard point. So what is Diego Garcia, really, when you strip the talking points? It is a coral atoll in the British Indian Ocean Territory story, and now in a Mauritian sovereignty story with a British-American base bolted on for a century. It is a runway on the West Arm and a lagoon that can hide a fleet's worth of logistics. It is a place almost no civilian will ever set foot. By design, it is the quiet hinge between the Middle East, South Asia, and the wider Indo-Pacific. It is proof that geography still decides wars even when speeches pretend otherwise. And it is a moral scar, an emptied homeland that made the hinge possible. Listen to how quietly an empire can move when the island is far enough from cameras. The Chagos are more than 1,000 miles from India, farther still from London, far enough that a decision made in conference rooms could erase a society before most of the world learned the names of the islands. That distance was not a side effect, it was part of the design. If you want a secret base, you pick a place the evening news cannot casually visit. And yet secrets leak through people. Chagossians carried the story in their bodies to Mauritius. They carried it into British courts decades later. They carried photographs of homes that no longer appear on tourist maps because tourists are not allowed. Every time a government called the island empty, someone who had been born there could answer, "Empty of us, because you made it so." There is also the American half of the silence. Washington needed the runway and the lagoon. London supplied the legal wrapper and the removals. Two allies, one footprint, shared deniability. That partnership is why the base endured through Vietnam's long shadow, through the Cold War's end, through the forever wars of the 2000s, and into an era when the Indian Ocean is again a contest of great powers. China's navy expands, Iran's missiles stretch the map of fear. Shipping lanes remain the bloodstream of globalization. In that world, Diego Garcia is not nostalgia. It is a continuing bet that geography still beats rhetoric. So when you hear politicians argue about leases and flags and annual payments, translate the argument back into coral. They are arguing about who owns the paper on an island that already owns the air and sea approaches to half a hemisphere. They are arguing about whether a 99-year clock is long enough to outlast the next crisis. They are rarely arguing, in the same sentence, about whether the people removed should walk that runway as residents again. Hold those two clocks in your head. The lease clock, decades of guaranteed access for bombers and ships. The exile clock, decades of families waiting for a return that the base keeps postponing. Diego Garcia is where those clocks tick in the same lagoon. Look at the map one more time. A blue desert of ocean, a thin horseshoe of land. Bombers that can leave that runway and touch crises half a world away. A British legal wrapper around an American spear. Families who still say the names of islands they were told to forget. A treaty that tries to settle sovereignty without settling the absence at the center of the story. There is an island in the Indian Ocean with almost no civilians. Not because the land could not hold life, because a deal decided life was in the way. Diego Garcia, British soil, American bombers. A base the public never visits, built on an absence you can still feel. Empty on purpose, strategic on purpose, and unfinished, as long as the people removed from that coral still have nowhere on it to go home.